RCOP meeting. Today we've got the NIST special never mind. All right, today we've got 800-171 revision 3 and what we all know and love. And so a little bit of front matter as people get in and get their audio on. Some of it, quite a bit of it you've heard before. And then we are lucky enough to be joined by a special guest from NIST. And then for the first time ever, we have our presenter with conflicts. So we will be hearing from Derek Phillips, but it will be a video of him, but he is talking to us. This has not been produced prior. It's not online, but this is his message to us. And so we'll get to hear a little bit about his take on what we should be coming away from 800-171 with. We had seen him prior, so that'll be a repeat. Well, his face will be a repeat. And then we'll hear a little bit from Laura on things that have not come up yet, maybe that we should be wondering about this. And all right, to get going with that, who's our cop? You've all seen this one before, and if you haven't, welcome, because that means you're new. And please add your name to list. And I see the Shrek photo is now somewhere in the middle. Sheesh, that's on every page now. We're 270 organizations right now, and mostly we're here to support each other with various regulations that we have to support in our research portfolios. We're looking to help each other out and increase the knowledge base, as well as, I should also mention in every setting that this is an NSF funded board. One of the big things that came out, and we talked about it last month, but we created an SSP with 43 of the controls filled out in a draft format at the workshop on May 1st. And why I mentioned it again today was we now have it behind an educause.edu style login, or educause and friends, but this is no longer a public document that's out there for anyone to just grab. But I do hope that all of us grab it, because it is a phenomenal resource, and hopefully it will help you when looking at your own SSPs. As I joked on the Shrek comment, I'm really, really hoping that some of you can submit some feedback to Eric and myself. It's annual report for a season for us, and I mean that's not the exciting part, but the exciting part is when NSF gets to hear things that this is going well for the community, or this was a wise investment for themselves, that they're more likely to persist with funding opportunities for this. So if you're able to help me out on that, write up something about resources you found, or I don't know, just general how RCOP has impacted you or your institution. I really, really appreciate that. And I was saying about a week window. I could be open to about 2, but yeah, just if you can, please help. This page I'm actually pretty proud of, because usually I'm able to talk about what's coming up next month, and that's pretty much all I've got. We are proud to say that we have almost all of the slots filled up for the remaining duration of this year. So to promote a few of them, we've got next month, we'll be hopefully be hearing from Blue Cyber, and they are an Air Force resource set up to help small businesses and academics kind of do the defense industrial base. And so trainings on that, what do they have available? And in talks with her, she wanted me to also promote that on June 27th there will be a cybersecurity resources Lollapalooza, and got the link into that in the Google Doc. Then there's also, I wanted to highlight that we have a small opportunity right now for PERC scholarships, and PERC will be in Portland, I believe. Yeah, Portland. And that is a community where it's the research facing people. They're slightly getting into cybersecurity, but it's a good conference. I've been to it several times before when I was more engaged on the research side of the house. So if you're interested in a scholarship for that link is there too. Then coming up, we get to harvest more information from Anurag, and this was going to be climbing the NIST mountains. We do have a researcher-facing focus session coming up, and that one will be some of the research facilitation that's happening at UC San Diego. We'll then also be hopefully hearing from University of Colorado, who's currently going through a C3PO gap assessment. And finally, we're also going to hear from UC San Diego, who's moving forward with a mock assessment, but it's sponsored by the leadership in cyber AV. So looking forward to all of that, and there you go. That's at least at a glance what's coming up. I also wanted to highlight one page that I've been working with recently with Jarrett Cummins from Educause, and this is getting the requests for comments more public and more aggregated to ourselves. So on our own page of the federal updates, we now share what's currently open for comments, here's the link to it, here's how you get your voice heard in this space. And that's kind of where it's pretty exciting, because two of these are going to be topics that we continue talking with. As I mentioned before, we are lucky enough to have Gemma Howell joining us from NIST to share one of the current open for comments items. And I also highlight the red one due to, well, that will be the rest of our topic today. So with that, Gemma, can you please introduce yourselves? We'd love to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Gemma Howell. I'm a computer scientist at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Very excited to be here and want to thank you for giving me a few minutes just to talk about our cybersecurity for research and development. We can jump to the next slide. So first off, I want to admit that I am not on the 171 team. Unfortunately, they send their regards. They were not able to make it because they had some other engagements lined up. But we're certainly here to take notes and pass along any feedback that you'd like us to. And again, thank you for allowing us to join. They did share just 2 slides that they wanted me to go over. They had a webinar June 6, 2023, and it was hosted by the authors, and it gave an overview of significant changes in 800-171 Rev 3, a discussion of the design principles and rationale behind the changes. It focused on areas where NIST seeks additional and specific input, and it offered some information about how to engage. And it also, they also had a live Q&A. The slides are available at the URL on the screen, and the webinar was also recorded. That should be available no later than June 20th. Next slide. So just a little bit more about the public comment period. So public comment is open through July 14th, and they're seeking specific feedback on all aspects of the draft and supplemental materials. And here it just highlights a few of the areas that they're looking for some specific feedback: recategorized controls, inclusion of organization defined parameters, and a prototype CUI overlay. And so comments can be submitted to the email address 800-171 comments@list.nist.gov. They do provide a recommended template for you to use. And the final note is that the comments will be posted publicly after they sort everything out. Next slide. And so although we're not the 171 team, there is a tie-in to the broader focus that we have on cybersecurity risks for research and development. And so now I'll go into a little bit of background about why we're focusing on this. Next slide. So in the CHIPS and Science Act, under Section 10229, NIST has an overarching task to disseminate and make publicly available tailored resources to help qualifying institutions identify, assess, and manage and reduce the cybersecurity risk related to conducting research. This slide here pulls some quotes and information directly from that statute. And it also includes additional details from the statutes about what those resources should include. Things like being generally applicable and usable to qualifying institutions, including specific case studies and examples and scenarios for practical applications, which has been really helpful as we've talked to different groups. And so I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just a background slide to tell a little bit about what we're doing and what we're focused on. Next slide. And so my colleagues and I are new to this space, and what we're looking to do is to hear from the education and research and development community about the different cybersecurity challenges, understand where NIST can provide resources to support research performed by higher education institutions. And this is the timeline. That middle area is our timeline and where we've been working. So I don't know if I mentioned this before, but this the statute was established in August 2022, and we have a year to put out an initial resource. So this August 2023 is when we plan to put out an initial resource. And so what we've been doing is some initial discovery exercises to conduct some initial engagements with folks. And we recently developed and put out a request for comment, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide. Like I said, we're looking to understand the cybersecurity challenges in the R&D space, and where we can provide resources. From then on, we plan to continue to engage with folks and gather as much information as we can to plan out what that initial resource could be that we put out in August. We noted a couple of other things that are happening, some concurrent activities that are happening and somewhat related. So like the 800-171 that's being updated, you'll see there in the top right that in July, they have their public comment period ending, and also down at the bottom, the cybersecurity framework 2.0 is also being updated. And we've heard a lot about how those two resources are either being used or leveraged, or folks are familiar with and are interested in how those could be maybe evolved or used to help in this space. Next slide. So this is my second to last slide. Like I mentioned, we have a request for comment out right now. This list that you see on the screen includes some of the questions that we have. Like I mentioned, what are the common cybersecurity challenges and risks? Under number 3, one of the sub-questions is, how do NIST resources such as 800-171, how do they support cybersecurity risk management in your institution? Are there other resources that you currently leverage? And then any thoughts on new resources or areas of further research that might address some cybersecurity challenges around research and development. So that is out right now. And we want to hear from you through the request for comment period. But we also, we're also open to one-on-one meetings if you want to reach out to us directly, or if you want to do a group listening session, we're happy to host or have one, set that up, because we'd really like to hear from you. And if in-person conversations are easier, we're happy to do so. Next slide. And so, yeah, that's it for me. We don't want to detract too much from this session. Thank you for the few minutes to go over what we have going on. And again, for those interested in meeting with us on one-on-one, or would like to do a similar discussion or listening session, feel free to reach out to us at cyber4r and &D@nist.gov. Or you can email me directly, Gemma, GEMA @nist.gov. And that's it for me.
We'll pause here, though. I'm curious how this crew would like to proceed with what can we do for Gemma. So yeah, min-max group size.
I think the offering to have some group discussions is a good one, and I know not only in ARCOP but also in the EDUCAUSE group next week we can probably generate things. Gemma, from your perspective, if we're going to do a group discussion, what's an optimum group size so that we don't dilute it too far? 10 people, 15 people?
Yeah, that's what we've talked about, around 10 or 15 max. For the group size, and maybe if we need to do more, maybe breaking it up into separate groups.
Yeah, that may be the more easy, because the difficulty here is to get all those schedules matched, and we don't want to turn this into a calendar exercise. So perhaps establishing 2 or 3 sessions or however many, depending on interest, and then making them kind of available, something like that may be easier than trying to say, let's coordinate them like we might for a single meeting.
Yeah, sounds good.
And Lewis, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to state that I hope this will be more of a conversation and less of a listening session. I was in the NSPM 33 listening, which I think was valuable, but I think conversation might be more productive in this particular case.
Yeah, absolutely. And the goal would be to, talk through some of those questions that we have. And we've done some one-on-one meetings already, where we've talked with folks and we've learned a lot about some specific use cases or areas where folks think that there can be improvement. And so, yeah, absolutely a back and forth is our goal, with the goal of hearing more from you. We don't want to take up too much time.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. With that, we will continue on. Please contact Gemma, and we'll also return any information on dates or times that we could bring a group of us together. So thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
And next, as I mentioned, we have Derek Phillips. He actually is doing a keynote right now, and therefore wanted to wish us well, but was also in the state where he had a conflict. Therefore, for the first time ever, our presenter will not be physically present with us. So any questions we have for just him will have to go back afterward. But this is a specially tailored message for us. It will be an 18-minute long video, and Yes, well, that's weird. I will be now showing a video in a recorded video.
Greetings, regulator research community. It is great to be back with you all. Always a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you. You all are interested in how the initial public draft for NIST SP 800-171 revision 3 is going to impact your institutions and your CMMC compliance activities. So I'm here to hopefully provide some clarity and reduce some anxiety that you may have. As a certified CMMC provisional assessor and instructor, someone who eats, lives, sleeps CMC and NIST 800-171, I'm just going to provide you my personal opinions and what I've gleaned over the past month since NIST has released that initial public draft. So it's a lot has happened. I've learned a lot, and yeah, it's just exciting. But I'm going to share with you my thoughts, so let's dive in. So I guess the best place to start is, okay, how does this impact you and your institutions, your compliance efforts? I know the reaction for many of you all were like, oh, great. We've been working so hard trying to comply with NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. Now we have a new special publication to comply with. That's understandable, but keep in mind that this is just the initial public draft as outlined during the webinar by Dr. Ron Ross and Victoria Piliteri. Yeah, this is a process going to have to go through the public comments period, which are due by July 14th. Then they are going to review those comments, take them in consideration when finalizing revision 3. And they anticipate that being published in Q1 of 2024. Then at that point, hey, it's going to take time before the federal agencies like the Department of Defense, it requires the defense industrial base to comply with revision 3. As we see how long CMMC 2.0 has taken, yeah, you have time. So take a deep breath, don't panic, continue focusing on this SP 800-171 revision 2. That is the current standard required by DFAR 7012, and that is what CMMC 2.0 will align with once that rule is published. A few months ago, I was watching a podcast interview that Stacy Bosjanik did. So many of y'all know that she is the DoD CIO for the CMMC program. The interviewer asked her how would the release of NIST SP 800-171 revision 3 impact the timeline for CMMC 2.0. She mentioned that CMMC 2.0 will continue to be aligned with NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. And she stated that in order to align CMMC with NIST SP 800-171 revision 3, that's going to have to go through its own rulemaking process as well. So based on those comments, I think it's pretty safe to assume if that's still the case. Like I said, this interview was months ago, but yeah, it's going to have to be a separate rulemaking process. Everything that DoD has done up to this point with CMMC 2.0 is directly aligned to NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. And again, we see how long that process is taking. So for them to have to go through this process again to align with revision 3, using deductive logic, I think we can safely estimate a couple years at the earliest before your institutions, before the DIB will be assessed against the revision 3 requirements. However, that's my personal opinion. I don't have any other insider tips or knowledge outside of hearing Stacy's interview, but I found that very interesting that she stated that the CMMC program, DFAR 7021, would need to go through a new rules making process to incorporate revision 3. Some additional intelligence I have gathered just having my ear to the CMMC streets. I follow attorney Robert Metzger pretty closely on LinkedIn. Many of you know he is a procurement attorney who specializes in federal contracts. So he follows CMMC very closely and anything related to federal procurement. He made a few posts recently on his LinkedIn page kind of outlining his forecast when DoD will align the CMMC program with the NIST SP 800-171 revision 3. And by all accounts, he's estimating years, 2-3 years at the earliest. in one of his recent posts that he made last month, he drew a parallel between how the FedRAMP program is just now requiring the NIST SP 800-53 requirements. And he said that was initially released in 2020. So he said it's taken years before the FedRAMP program is able to require that companies are assessed against the newest version of 800-53. So kind of give you an idea that this is nothing that's going to happen overnight. It certainly is a long process when you're talking about rulemaking and just the impact it's going to have on potentially hundreds of thousands of companies. So again, back to my original advice, don't panic, take a deep breath, focus on complying with the current requirements outlined in DFAR 7012. That's going to align with NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. Don't get distracted. But since we're here gathered together, we might as well talk about some of the exciting updates in the 800-171 revision 3 initial public draft. There definitely is a lot to be excited about. I think seeing the direction that NIST is going with 800-171, essentially making sure that they're aligning with the 800-53 Bravo, that moderate baseline, cutting down on a lot of ambiguity, making the guidance clear. So I think that's a good thing. So for the remainder of this video, a lot of the updates I'll provide you, I gathered from watching the interview that Jacob Horn from Summit 7 did on the Summit Up podcast with Dr. Ron Ross, who's one of the authors of 800-171 revision 3, the draft. Yes, I did watch that entire interview, 3 hours and 31 minutes to be precise. I geeked out on it. It was pretty entertaining. I got my popcorn and was relaxing on the couch just listening to that interview. So I'm ashamed to say that instead of binging on Netflix, I like to watch those long form interviews conducted by Jacob Horn. They're pretty entertaining for us compliance geeks. Dr. Ross gave a lot of insight on just the history of 800-171, how it ties into 853, and pretty much their approach to the revision, that continuous improvement approach that they're taking. So if you don't have 3.5 hours to spend watching that video, you're in luck. I'm going to give you the key cliff notes, the takeaways. One of the biggest takeaways was Dr. Ross provided more context around the organizational defined parameters. When I first looked at the initial public draft, that was one of the key things that popped out to me was some of the controls have the organizational defined parameters. And my initial reading of that was organization, like this kind of vague, like who is the organization? It kind of comes across as the organization being the defense contractor, but Dr. Ross in that interview, he clarified that the organization is actually the federal agency, so not the defense contractor. So that federal agency has the first right of refusal. They are the ones who are able to take that risk-based approach and define the minimum baseline. One of those controls that has the organizational defined parameters is related to the FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography. And there was a lot of talk that, that maybe FIPS, that standard's going away, and maybe the DIB no longer has to have the FIPS validated encryption. But based on the context that Dr. Ross provided, he's pretty much stating that, it's going to be the federal agency who's making that risk-based decision. If any controls that have the organizational defined parameters included, then that federal agency is making that minimum baseline. So in the context of the Department of Defense, I think chances are they are going to define those organizational defined parameters, those minimum baselines. So when it comes to FIPS validated encryption, I believe that's still going to be a minimum standard that the Department of Defense defines. And therefore, it's going to be required for all defense contractors and subcontractors. Dr. Ross did mention the organizational defined parameters. Their intent with those is to give federal agencies more flexibility to make risk-based decisions and decide what that minimum baseline is for their supply chain. However, he pointed out that the federal government they still have that requirement by law for FIPS validated encryption. So as we know, the requirements follows the information. So wherever that information goes, the value is the same. And that's something that Dr. Ross reiterated throughout that interview, that the value of FCI, CUI, the impact to national security, it does not change once it leaves that federal agency. It still has the same value, same impact. So therefore, the requirements follows the information, wherever that information flows. So that's important to keep in mind. So it does make sense that the organization is the federal agencies, not the defense contractor. However, Dr. Ross did mention that federal agencies could essentially pass on actually establishing those minimum baselines for the controls that has the organizational defined parameters and leave it up to the contractors. However, that's to be determined. But again, in the context of Department of Defense, I wouldn't get my hopes up about that one. Going back to my initial reaction video that I posted last month, I really focused on 3 of the top changes that, in my opinion, were going to be the most impactful for the defense industrial base in regards to NIST SP 800-171 Revision 3. On my top 3 lists, so that first one was 3.12.5, the requirement for independent assessment. So that one jumped out to me like a freight train. I was like, wow, this is a big change, a big deviation from 800-171 Revision 2. And Dr. Ross did talk about this control during the interview. And essentially he stated that, yes, it really comes down to that level of assurance for the federal agencies. Having an independent assessment, which is a requirement in NIST SP 800-171-53, Revision 5, that moderate baseline. But the biggest breaking news with that and the clarity that Dr. Ross provided is in relation to independent. What does that mean? So essentially, Dr. Ross explained that larger organizations will be able to essentially demonstrate that perhaps their internal audit team that does not have a conflict of interest, maybe has a separate line of reporting, they can assess the 800-171 Revision 3 requirements independently. However, he did emphasize that smaller companies, smaller organizations, that's going to be tougher to do because they just maybe don't have those separate lines of reporting and can't really fully demonstrate that there's no conflict of interest, that the results of that assessment is not going to have any impact on the assessor or the audit team. Yeah, that potentially can be some good news for universities. So again, this is separate from CMMC, but in terms of just 3.12.5, the independent assessment does not necessarily mean you have to hire a company like Aspire Cyber or one of the CMMC third-party assessors to satisfy that requirement. So DoD still is going to require, as far as getting the CMMC assessment completed to get that certification for level 2, that's going to require a C3PAO. In order to satisfy 3.12.5, independent assessment. Again, for smaller companies, they're likely going to have to hire an external independent assessor, a company outside of your organization to perform those assessments. Larger companies, larger institutions like universities likely have an internal audit team and they can demonstrate that independence. The next requirement that I highlighted in my initial reaction video is 3.15.1, policies and procedures. So we know in 800-171 Revision 2, the policies and procedures, all of the documentation is in the Appendix E for tailoring and those NFO controls. So the controls that essentially when 800-171 Revision 2 was written, that they assumed that organizations had those controls in place already. And in regards to CMMC, those are in scope. Any of those NFO controls are in scope for the CMMC 2.0 assessments. But for Revision 3, 3.15.1, policies and procedures, essentially that is brought into the publication. So from the tailoring, it's no longer an NFO control. It's actually a direct requirement, so there's no confusion. 3.15.1 is going to require the defense industrial base to develop, document, and disseminate their policies and procedures to implement information security requirements. The next significant change to round out my top 3 list is 3.16.3, external system services, requiring essentially your external service providers like your IT managed service providers or security service providers essentially are going to have to comply with your organization's security requirements. So essentially requiring you to have a third-party risk management program in place, ensuring that you're doing your due care and due diligence and evaluating the security of your supply chain. If they have access to that CUI that's in scope, then those requirements are going to flow down to your supply chain as well. So you're going to need to demonstrate that you are managing the risks associated with your supply chain. That value of the controlled unclassified information at CUI, whether it's with the federal agency, once it leaves the federal agency, goes to the supply chain, from the prime to the sub, maybe from the sub to another sub or to their MSP. Yeah, the requirements follows the information, especially regarding those organizational defined parameters. Overall, that interview, again, it was very insightful, and it was cool to learn a lot more about Dr. Ross's journey as a public servant, from serving in the military to the NSA to defense contractor to NIST, and just a esteemed career of over 50 years of public service. So I found it really inspirational. Someone that wakes up every morning, loves what they do, can't wait to get to work and continue improving the special publications that impact so many organizations. So definitely a special thanks to Dr. Ross and Victoria Pillitary for their service. And lastly, the webinar that Victoria Pillitary and Dr. Ross delivered on June 6th was really insightful. I think one of the key takeaways for me was pretty much laying out the timeline for when I anticipate publishing the final version of revision 3, so Q1 of 2024. And then also highlighting the importance of you all submitting your public comments before that July 14th deadline. Highly encourage you to do so you have some say-so in the final version. But I don't anticipate any major changes between the initial public draft and the final version. However, we shall see. But overall, I think it's a great improvement from revision 2. Just to reiterate, your focus in terms of compliance and getting ready for CMMC 2.0 is stay focused on revision 2. Those are the recurrent requirements that align to CMMC 2.0. I personally don't foresee that changing for at least a couple years, the earliest. So stay focused, keep working hard. You have more than enough work ahead of you focusing on revision 2. So don't get distracted by the revision 3. Just kind of keep an eye on it in terms of giving you an idea of direction that 800-171 is going. But nothing to be alarmed about today, tomorrow, or maybe within the next couple years. On that note, always a pleasure speaking to the regulated research community. I hope to come back soon and be with you live. Good luck to y'all in your CMMC compliance journey.
All right. Let's go with a little more live discussion from Laura.
Yeah, so Carolyn asked me to create, just create some content for people to think about. But I'll second everything Derek said. Don't freak out yet. It's not time yet. That being said, there are some choices that you might want to consider changing if you haven't implemented something in R2 yet. But don't, R2 is your goal for now until we hear otherwise. But some of the things that I'll share my screen, this is all pasted into the document, but some of the items that are just going to flat out cost money based on between R2 and R3. Again, this is assuming that things don't change. They can. Please put in comments. Be very careful how you word your comments and make sure that you stay within what NIST has control over, which in this situation is very strange because NIST points to the DoD like, well, they're making you do it. And the DoD is pointing to NIST that, well, they're making the rules. And so there's really no good method to comment on the actual implementation of things. And so be very careful when you are making comments that you are focused on, well, this control is worded poorly, or this control doesn't make sense. We don't have enough background information. We don't have enough definition, things like that. It's, you know, I don't like the ODPs. It's probably not going to get, you know, it's going to get the, yeah, this comment doesn't apply to us. So just keep that in mind when you do submit your comments, because to NIST, it is the only what NIST can control. So I want to be very clear on that when you submit comments. I just kind of put a list together of things that are going to cost us money. There are some that just because of the control, it's going to cost money above and beyond R2. In 336 audit record reduction, you have to preserve the original content and time ordering of audit records. I know a lot, it's kind of a common practice to, once it's been through your review system, right, your Splunk or whatever, to reduce the logs so that you're not storing as much. But this requirement is saying, no, you have to have the original content, which means increases our storage, increases the costs there. Impact analyses, if you're not already doing impact analyses for change management, so you have to verify the controls that were impacted. So you do a change to the system, they're requiring that you actually verify those controls after the change is made. A lot of folks are doing this, not everybody, so it might not, you know, apply to you. 348, authorized software. Previously, we could have a whitelist or a blacklist. Now it is whitelist or allow list only. That could cost money from both a software perspective, because who's going to want to do that manually? But also, if you're not paying for the software, somebody's doing that manually. And especially in a university setting where researchers are downloading things left and right off of GitHub, that could be a pretty big overhead for just managing that whitelist. Like, for example, for us, right now, we say, well, anything that CrowdStrike blocks is on our block list. And that's how we're managing that control. But in R3, it's only whitelist and allow list. In 352, it's asking to ID and authenticate devices before allowing system or network connections. So this is talking about, you know, wireless has to have some kind of authentication and device identification. Your network, you know, if you're on your wired network, your devices have to authenticate. So MAC addressing, that's happening in some places, not happening in others. That's something that could just cost money for, well, we need to buy the software that's going to do that for us. The MFA is now everywhere. You must multi-factor to system accounts, system level accounts. One comment that I've read is that, well, system accounts aren't exactly defined. So what are they talking about? But the way I'm reading this is you can't just have two-factor on your VPN any longer. It is on your systems. That could require software if you don't already have it. 357 requires checking against known compromised passwords. If you are using Azure, GCP, AWS authentication systems, they're doing that in the most cases. If you're using an on-premise authentication system or on-premise Active Directories, you're going to have software or development in order to check against the known compromised passwords. And I kind of think that if a lot of people are doing this, have I been pwned? We'll start charging more. And so it's not going to be a free service any longer. And so that could be a potential issue. 362C, I actually have a comment to this in my listing of comments, but it says provide an incident response support resource that offers advice and assistance to users of the system. And then in the discussion, which the discussion is not a requirement, just be clear about that. It's referencing access to forensic services or consumer redress services. So that's basically having an open contract with, like, say, Mandiant or other forensic services, or having somebody on staff that can be that incident support resource to answer the questions. So that could be costly from a resource perspective. 389, encrypt your backups. That could be FIPS, depends on the, as Derek said, the organizational defined parameters, which could be pricey, especially if you're not already encrypting your backups. You have to go back and re-encrypt them. Physical access is now a little bit more broadly defined as a facility. And you have to monitor your physical access even to publicly accessible areas. And I know a lot of us on campuses, our buildings are open. Anybody can walk in off the street and get into most of the buildings. Obviously, there are going to be locked doors if you have data centers, things like that, that, you know, we have to be careful of how facility is defined. And it's not in the in the documents. So that's another one of my comments. But also access to control for transmission and output devices. The output devices has been in R2, so printers, things like that. But transmission, so if you've got open cabling going through, say, your sewers that your students like to go through, you have to you restrict access to all that cabling. We have cabling, open cabling going in and out of our data center. Like I could just reach up to the ceiling and touch the cabling going into the data center. Derek mentioned the independent assessment. Again, most of us have internal audit, but let's just add more work to internal audit and they're going to charge us more, especially if it's an external party that's doing our internal audit. Or you're going to be paying for somebody to do that independent assessment. The way I read it is if you do have a CMMC assessment, that's going to cover your independent assessment. But that's, again, that's unknown. 313.8 cryptography at rest. Used to be you could do cryptography or physical protection. Now it's you're going to use cryptography at rest. And if the organizational defined parameter is FIPS, that means FIPS, cryptography at rest. I know a lot of folks have mentioned that certain types of systems, especially in the HPC world, if you don't encrypt it when you start the system, you don't have the opportunity to encrypt it later. And so that could be costly from a just, you know, how are we going to implement that? 313.17, an authenticated proxy server for outgoing connections. How many people have proxy servers for outgoing connections? And then how many people have authenticated proxy servers for outgoing connections? And so that could be, some of us, that could be a lot of traffic. It could be a pretty beefy system to be able to handle that traffic. But that's a cost if you're not already doing that. 314.8 spam protection. You're using a cloud service provider, you're getting some of that, but there is no guidance on scope or applicability, right? If I don't have email in my CMMC enclave, do I have to implement this? Or do I have to implement anyway because I have users that read their email, not necessarily from my environment, but they're reading their email. 316.2, unsupported system components. This is basically you can't use stuff that the vendor doesn't support anymore, or you have to provide options. So this, you know, this is really big in lab equipment, in old, you know, I know people have very old equipment for lots of reasons that you can't afford to upgrade the equipment, or you have no need to upgrade the equipment, but the vendor does, you know, vendor's gone out of business 20 years ago. And this tends to apply in labs and will definitely apply in a lot of research areas that need to use that specialized equipment. So those are things that they're just going to be expensive just because of the way the control is written. There are other things that could be expensive depending on what that organizational defined parameter is. The organizational defined parameters, as Derek said, the federal agency has first right of refusal to define it. There are some that when you read them, there is no business that the DoD is telling me who I need to notify in my organization when I see an incident. So there are some that are very much, you know, why would you tell us this? And then there are some that the DoD could basically make cruel in this case. Some of those access control for mobile devices, they can pick full disk encryption or container-based encryption. So if your contract now says container-based encryption and you're using full disk encryption, all of a sudden you've got to change how you're implementing things. And if you've got a federal agency that says full disk encryption and a federal agency that says container-based encryption, how do you resolve that? Is full disk encryption better or is container-based better? In that case, there's some areas where it's very clear which is the better, security option, but in some cases it's not. Using the external systems, the DoD gets to define your terms and conditions of using external systems. I don't think any lawyers would be okay with that on any level. But also the organization, the feds, can define what controls that your external systems must enforce. And you can prohibit organizational defined types of external systems. So the DoD could theoretically just say, sorry, you can't use Google. Or you cannot use anything that's not FedRAMP. So this one could get really interesting, especially on the legal side with the terms and conditions. Obviously, there's already mandatory flow down clauses that are in place, and maybe that's how they're going to leave it. But that could be kind of nasty. Auditing. The feds get to define what events you're going to log. They also get to define how long you keep those logs. Those of us who have dealt with NSPM 33 have run into OMB 2131, which is the lovely government document that we're like, what are you talking about? Why? What do you mean I have to keep all this stuff? So that could be expensive, especially for those of us that are using Splunk, either on-site or hosted. Could really be pricey, and even just buying disks if you're using something different. 342 configuration settings. The feds get to define what your secure configurations are. So the feds could say, no, you're going to use the DISA STIGs. Or the feds could say, no, you're going to use the CIS benchmarks level 1. And some of that can be, especially in the research area, where we have to have things turned off or turned on in order for the researchers to do their research. Could be really interesting and costly, because now you're not able to do research in certain areas, and you're not able to, back off where you need to, and it doesn't make sense to have the full requirement. User installed softwares. The feds get to define how you're going to enforce controlling user installed software. Now, will the feds define all of these things? Maybe, maybe not. We can look at the FedRAMP controls as a guideline, as a potential possibility for what the DoD might want to define. That's not a guarantee. But a couple other big ones, the system and component configurations for high-risk areas. You issue a federal organizational defined device, so you're not the organization, for travel to high-risk areas. So this is basically the concept of a burner laptop. On the plus side, we as the organization implementing this get to decide what's high risk. That is surprisingly not a federal organizational defined parameter, which I find really strange, but that's how it is. The feds get to define what controls are going to be at your alternative work sites, which include employees' homes. And again, like Derek said, they have first right of refusal. They might not define any of this, but it's something to kind of keep your mind on. Control assessments. Feds get to define frequency. And then the comments is that it should be under independent services. Organizational defined cryptography. Yes, the word FIPS is out of R3, but the DoD could just still say FIPS anyway. For external system services, the feds get to define what controls you have to require of your external system services providers, and the processes and methods for oversight of those external systems. So they could, this is where they're probably going to say your external system services are going to be FedRAMP. This kind of basically gives the feds that right and that ability. So that's a quick, overview of things I think are going to be pricey or cost us in some way. But as Derek said, focus on R2. Look at R3 as if I have to make a decision about how I'm implementing R2, okay, maybe make it towards the R3 guidance, but you're still going to be assessed against R2 as it stands. I will stop my sharing, and I see a bunch of chats, but I didn't see what the questions are.
We have about a minute or so for the most pending question. You can come off mute. Wendy, I think your comment on the SOC one was pretty good too, of can they manage the 362C?
But we hope.
Yeah, I'd say with some of this has been we're currently going through an audit. I'm at Boulder, and some of the stuff has really been interesting, and some of these things that you're talking about are even more gotcha than in like some regards, just weird quirks to the control that like an auditor's like, oh yeah, you have to do this. But especially around like the disk encryption and stuff like that, because some of it's like, oh, you have these levels of disk encryption inside the, like we're using the cloud, but there's so many gotchas of what can work with what various forms of disk encryption that you just don't even run into until you come across it.
I will say, since it's the end of the slot, there is a new channel set up in the Slack site. It's the SP 800-171 R3 draft discussion and things like that, Chris. I think it's wise to start bringing these items to this discussion, especially as we approach the request for comments date. So.
Yeah, I just joined that and I saw the challenges and other stuff, and I'm like, okay, I can document this as I go along so people see it.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you so much, Laura. Very much appreciate that, and thank you all.
Thank you.